The idea that all human beings are fundamentally flawed and imperfect due to an inherited sinful state is a foundational teaching of mainstream Christianity as well as the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses. But does this idea stand up to logical scrutiny? That's what I'll be talking about on this week's episode of the Jexit podcast. Hello and welcome to the Jexit podcast. I'm your host Riley, a former Jehovah's Witness who left the religion in 2019. So whether you're a Christian or not, we all know the story of Adam, Eve, and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. To most believing Christians, it's the historical account of how sin first entered into the world. Now, in addition to believing this story, the JW religion also has this idea that the first human couple, Adam and Eve, were created as perfect beings. But after they sinned by disobeying God, they became imperfect and passed this imperfect state onto their offspring, and by extension, all humankind. Now, as someone who values rational thinking and tries to be rational in as many things as possible, I have several issues with this story, but here are the three main ones. Firstly, it just sounds like a myth. If you compare it to many other myths and legends from various cultures around the world throughout human history, it contains the same basic elements of moral lessons, supernatural beings, humans and animals with abilities that neither have today. Secondly, there's absolutely no evidence that any of these events ever took place. In order to believe this account, you essentially have to take the Bible's word for it. And lastly, nowhere in the Bible does it actually and explicitly say that Adam and Eve were perfect. The Bible does say that when God had finished his creative works, it was very good. But that's not the same as perfect. To believe that Adam and Eve were perfect requires you to read into the Bible things that aren't actually there. But putting all of my skepticism to one side, I'd argue that this account, particularly the JW interpretation of it, makes no sense on its face, specifically because of this idea of perfection and imperfection. But before I explain why, let's define what perfection actually means in this context. As an interesting side point, have you ever noticed how JW speakers in meetings and assemblies often refer to the dictionary definition of a word in the opening portion of their talks? Well, I'm trying really hard not to sound like that, so I'm not going to read the dictionary definition of perfect. In any case, I'm sure we can all agree on what it means. But what I'll do instead is explain what this idea means to Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I've spoken before about how much Jehovah's Witnesses love analogies. In fact, they hold analogies up to a similar sort of reverence as they hold the Bible. If you can explain something with an analogy, it's basically the truth. And a common one used in the religion to explain inherited imperfection is this. Imagine you have a mold of some kind, for example, a baking tin. Every cake you bake with that tin will take on the tin's shape. If the tin is perfectly round, then the cakes will be perfectly round. If the tin is perfectly square, then the cakes will be perfectly square. But if you were to put a dent in that tin, the tin is now imperfect, and every cake made from it will bear that mark of imperfection. So in a similar way, our ancestors, Adam and Eve, were like that cake tin that became dented after they disobeyed God. And as a result, all of their offspring now bear that mark of imperfection in the form of inherited sin. Now, at first, this line of reasoning seems to be quite logical. But as is the case with a lot of JW reasoning, it only seems logical because it's based on either flawed or incomplete information. So what is a flaw in this idea of human perfection and imperfection? Well, in a nutshell, I'd say that human perfection is something that's impossible to define and stroke or quantify, which would then render imperfection as a non-concept. For something to be described as imperfect, it would have to fall short of a definable benchmark or perfect standard. That just stands to reason, and I'm sure that even Jehovah's Witnesses would agree with that. So what is the definable benchmark or perfect standard where human beings are concerned? What are the ways in which a human being could possibly be perfect? Well, let's think about it. When you look at the wide array of human characteristics, skills, and abilities, I'd say that you could organize them into three main categories: physical, emotional, and intellectual. Now, I tried really hard to think of any other categories that I might have missed, but I think that's pretty much it. If you can think of any others, please feel free to let me know in the comments. So in those three categories, I'm sure you can place everything that makes a person a person. For example, in the physical category, you can place things like height, weight, eye color, skin color, hair length, bone density, muscle strength, running speed, etc. We could go on forever of things to put into this category. So let's ask the important questions. What is the perfect height for a human being? What is the benchmark standard? How tall in centimeters or feet and inches does a person have to be that if they were just 1 unit below that, they'd be considered too short to be perfect? Where do you draw that line? And what is the perfect benchmark standard for running a 100-meter sprint? So that if you were a fraction of a second slower, you'd be considered imperfect. What is the perfect benchmark standard for example, a barbell squat? So that if your 1 rep maximum was just a single gram lighter, you'd be considered imperfectly weak. Do you see where I'm going with this? Let's look at the emotional category. In this category, you could put things like empathy, compassion, sensitivity, patience, emotional intelligence, etc. So again, let's ask the questions. How patient does a person have to be considered perfect? How would you even measure such a thing? Are they allowed to get agitated if their flight is delayed by 1 hour? Or is it 2 hours? Or 3? Let's say it's 3 hours. If they got annoyed after waiting for 2 hours and 59 seconds, are they now considered to be imperfect? Where is the cutoff point? And what about sensitivity? How sensitive are perfect people? What's the appropriate level of sensitivity for them to have? It's a universally accepted law that insulting someone's mum is way worse than insulting their dad. So are perfect people allowed to feel insulted by your mama jokes? But if they feel insulted by your papa jokes, they're labeled as too sensitive and therefore imperfect. What about empathy? How empathetic should a perfect person be? What's the perfect empathetic response to seeing, say, a wounded animal, for example? Would a perfect person cry, or would they just feel sad? Would they lose their badge of perfection if they felt sad but didn't cry? Where do you draw that line? Lastly, let's look at the intellectual category. In here, we can place things like IQ, reading speed, mental arithmetic, concentration span, etc. So for one final time, let's ask the important questions. Now, I know that the standard IQ test is highly problematic for many reasons that I won't go into, but let's just run with it for now. How many IQ points does a person have to be viewed as perfect? Opinions on this statistic that I'm about to quote vary, but several sources credit a man called Young Hoon Kim, and I know I butchered that. Please forgive me. Several sources credit him as being the most intelligent person in the world with the highest ever recorded IQ score of 276. To put that number into perspective, the average IQ is about 100. So is 276 the perfect IQ score? If you were just 1 point below that, would you be classed as imperfect? What about your attention span? What's that like? For how long can you concentrate on a particular task before you get bored and start scrolling social media on your phone? Is it 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or half an hour? What would that time be for a perfect person? Let's be super generous and say 24 hours. If someone were only able to concentrate on the same task for 23 hours and 59 seconds, would that doom them to a life of imperfection, sin, and death? Let's look at one more example. To how many digits should a perfect human being be able to calculate pi, which is the ratio of a circle's circumference relative to its diameter? According to the Pi World Ranking List, the current record holder for reciting pi is a man called Suresh Kumar Sharma, and he was able to recite pi to 70,030 digits. It took him 17 hours and 14 minutes to accomplish this. Is that the perfect benchmark standard? Obviously not, because Suresh is an imperfect descendant of Adam and Eve. So the perfect standard should be at least 1 digit above his score at 70,031 digits, right? Or maybe the perfect standard is the same number of digits, but in a faster time. Now, I know the examples I've used are far from perfect, if you'll pardon the pun, and I'm sure I also laboured the point. But I did so for good reason, and that is to show that regardless of which metric you choose, it's impossible to define and stroke or quantify perfection as it relates to human beings. Firstly, there are just too many human attributes to consider. And secondly, setting a standard for any one of them is just arbitrary, because just one unit above or below that standard just isn't enough to make a real difference, which renders the standard useless. So what does all of this mean? It means that if it's impossible to set a standard for perfection, then it stands to reason that it's also impossible to define imperfection, because there's no benchmark on which to make such a determination. Another way of thinking about it is like this. When it comes to the laws of a country or a society, the only way we know if something is legal is by first having laws that dictate what is illegal. You can't really have one without the other. Now, it's all well and good debunking the JW ideology of perfection and imperfection as an intellectual exercise. But there's a much better and more practical reason for doing so. This doctrine of imperfection is extremely damaging emotionally and detrimental to one's mental health. Imagine being indoctrinated from childhood to believe that there is something inherently wrong with you, that you're fundamentally flawed in every conceivable way, and were it not for the kindness of an invisible person that you'll never be able to earn or repay, and that you didn't even deserve in the first place, you'd be destined for the proverbial scrap heap. There's no way that such an idea wouldn't damage you at your core. In fact, I'd say that this is even more so the case for Jehovah's Witnesses than for mainstream Christians. From what I've learned from other Christian denominations, they have the doctrine of grace, which carries the idea of being shown loving compassion and mercy for your imperfect and sinful state, whereas the equivalent doctrine in the JW religion is called undeserved kindness, which in my opinion is a much harsher message with a backhanded condemnation. Since I started doing XJW activism, I've spoken to literally hundreds of former Jehovah's Witnesses, both publicly and privately. And something that they almost all attest to when speaking about their experiences in the religion is how worthless and useless the religion made them feel. I hear the same phrases over and over again. I have low self-esteem. I never felt good enough. I could never do enough. I was always told to do more. I could never do anything right. I always felt like there was something wrong with me. Honestly, what else should we expect from a religion that encourages its members to think of themselves as good-for-nothing slaves? And that's not an exaggeration. They literally do that. If you're a former or current Jehovah's Witness listening to this and you can relate to these sentiments in any way, firstly, know that you're not alone. You don't have to define yourself by or measure yourself against this nonsensical doctrine. Discarding this way of thinking isn't easy, but the benefits of undoing this indoctrination are almost endless. I speak from personal experience when I say it's well worth it. Secondly, please understand that the fact that you're not perfect doesn't automatically mean that you're imperfect. That's the kind of dichotomous black and white thinking that is inherent to most cults and high control groups. Perfect, imperfect. These are terms that are just not applicable to human beings. It makes no sense. They are non-concepts. You're not imperfect. You're just uniquely you. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If so, please drop it a thumbs up and comment on YouTube or rate the podcast on your podcast platform. Also, please subscribe to keep up with future episodes. Thanks again for listening. I hope you have a great week.